Hey everyone, was machst du? What's going on? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Lamed Zayin, Daf 37 of Masechta Pesachim. Today's Daf, if my memory serves me, is not too difficult. Talk about Pas Uveh. We'll have to learn what that is. And then Challah a little bit, like what kinds of breads would be chayav in Challah. Let's just say that. Whoa, excuse me. We're going to start Daf Lamed Vav Mud Beis all the way at the bottom. Taner Rabbanon, the rabbis taught in Ofen Pas Uveh BePesach Divrei Beis Shammai. Okay, fine. So Beis Shammai says that we don't bake Pas Uveh on Pesach. Got it? Good. We're going to have to explain what Pas Uveh is. That's that's Beis Shammai's opinion. Beis Hillel Matirin. The Beis Hillel says you can bake Pas Uveh all you want. B'cham Pas Uveh. Nus, what's Pas Uveh? Rav Huna tefach. Oh, so Rav Huna says that Pas Uveh is bread, or really matzah, right? It can't be leavened, so it's unleavened bread that could be up to the thickness of a tefach. That would be Pas Uveh. So Beis Shammai says don't bake Pas Uveh on Pesach. Beis Hillel says you may. Shekein matzinu b'lechem aponim tefach, because we see by the lechem aponim, by the breads in the Beis Hamikdash, that they were made in a mold that was 1 tefach thick. Maskef Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef asked the kasha on Rav Huna. Im amru b'zrizin, yomu b'sheina zrizin. Im amru b'pas amela, yomu b'pas sheina amela. Im amru b'eitzim yiveshin, yomu b'eitzim lachim. Im amru b'taner cham, yomu b'taner tzonen. In amru b'taner shamateches, yomu b'taner shacheres. Rav Yosef says, Rav Huna, apples and oranges, yeah, sure, it may well be that in the Beis Hamikdash they made bread out of, that was a tefach thick and managed to keep it in a state of unleavenedness. Right, as Rashi points out, Sheu Asur Lavo Chametz, that the lechem aponim is unable to be chametz. Right, the only time that we had chametz in the Beis Hamikdash was the shtei alechem and one of the 4 types of toda breads. Otherwise, everything was unleavened. So Rav Yosef is basically saying to Rav Huna, like, yeah, I agree that in the Beis Hamikdash the lechem aponim could be a tefach thick, but apples and oranges, the Beis Hamikdash, they were very careful. And there was all sorts of other things that we're going to go through one at a time right now. But that doesn't mean that every Tom, Dick, and Harry in his house on Pesach could make tefach thick matzahs and run the risk of it being chametz. So let's read Rav Yosef slowly. Im amru b'zrizin, yomu b'sheina zrizin. In the Beis Hamikdash, as we saw the other day, the Kohanim are zrizin. The Kohanim are very on top of what's going on. They're going to make sure that it's not going to be chametz. But we can't just trust every Tom, Dick, and Harry to make sure that the bread doesn't become chametz. Apparently in the Beis Hamikdash, the dough that they would use for the lechem aponim, they would knead it extremely, extremely finely. So I guess that would kind of contribute to its not becoming chametz. Or you can't compare that to people who aren't kneading it extremely, extremely well. In the Beis Hamikdash, they dafka used very dry wood. That Rashi points out that in Masechta Taanis we say that you couldn't bring any wood to donate to the Beis Hamikdash after the 15th of Av because it wasn't dry enough. That they would use the driest wood. Right, and I guess if it's very dry wood, it would probably be a more intense heat, I guess, as opposed to eitzim lachim, moist wood, which probably wouldn't get as hot and may contribute to the bread becoming chametz. The oven in the Beis Hamikdash was very hot. It would be lit every single day. Right, and you can't necessarily compare that to an oven that may or may not be used every single day. I'll tell you one thing, my oven isn't used ever. But right now I'm at my parents' house and their oven gets used. But I haven't cooked anything in a year. I haven't cooked anything in an oven in a year. I slightly broke that streak by heating up soup recently. My mom's been making soup and I've been heating it up for lunch. So At first I was a little nervous because I didn't want to I didn't want to ruin my streak. But let's go weiter. So Im Amru Betaner Shamateches Yomu Betaner Shocheres, that in the Beis Hamikdash they were using an oven that was made of metal that would get very, very hot. But over here, regular Tom, Dick, and Harry, they're using a earthenware oven. So for all of these reasons, Rav Yosef is saying that yes, well, it's true. While it's true that in the Beis Hamikdash they had the lechem apanim that was a tefach thick, but that's not a reason to say that, just on Pesach you could be making matzahs that are a tefach thick. It's too risky. They could become chametz. Amr Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba. Who remembers Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba? I do. He was in the 4th parak of Masechta Brachos, although I can't remember what daf. Okay, what can I tell you? But he was he davened behind Rav, and we said that how could he daven behind Rav? That he was a Talmud Chover of Rav. So Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba says, She'ilis is Rebbe biyichud. I asked my Rebbe when we were alone, Umanu, who's Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba's Rebbe? Rav. Ikadamr, that those who say Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rav, that Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba said the name of his teacher Rav. She'ilis is Rebbe, that Rav said that he asked his teacher, who was that? Biyichud, in a private audience. Umanu Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Rav's teacher was Rebbe. Very interesting. Okay, I mean, we've seen lots of incidents with Rav and Rebbe, of course, especially with his uncle Reb Chia. A number of times we had incidents with Rav and Reb Chia and Rebbe, and Reb Chia called Rav a bar pachti because of things that he said in these encounters. My pasave, what is pasave? Pas meruba. It means a lot of bread. That's all it means. Pasave doesn't mean thick bread. It just means making a lot of bread at one time. V'mai karule pasave. So how come they're calling a lot of bread pasave, thick bread? Mishum denefisha belisha, because you have to knead it very well, and it's like very thick when you're kneading it. V'bay semo, if you want, I mean, you're gonna have to knead it all together first into the dough, and then you could break it up. So it's gonna be very big and thick when you're kneading it. V'bay semo, if you want, I will say ba'asri da'ai tana, that in the place where the tana of this brisa that says ein ofen pasave b'pesach, the place where he lives, lifas meruba pasave karule. They would call a lot of bread pasave. That's why they called it pasave. That was just what they called it where he lived. Okay, but now, fact the Gemara, my time, and what's wrong with making a lot of bread? How come I'm not allowed to make a lot of bread on Pesach? Meaning, obviously not chametz, but meaning matzahs or whatever. Meaning, I'm allowed to bake on Yontif. So imishum dekatarach tirchet lo tzarech. Well, maybe you'll say, well, because while you might be allowed to bake bread on Yom Tif, but how much bread do you need? Make enough for the meal or whatever it is. How come you're making this pas of it? How come you're making lots of bread? So it's a tircha. It's extra strain on Yom Tif. Ma'ir bePesach. But then what's so special about Pesach? Why does it say that you specifically can't make pas of it on Pesach? Afilu b'Yom Tif nami. Any Yom Tif you shouldn't be making way too much bread because it's an extra burden. So the Gemara answers Eina Chinami. You're right. It didn't have to say Pesach specifically. It could have been any Yom Tif. But Tana b'Yom Tif shel Pesach koi. This Tana was just talking about Pesach, so therefore he mentioned Pesach. But really, it could have been any holiday. You don't want to bake more than you need to. And you could bake for the Yom Tif, but don't bake more than you need to. Don't make lots and lots and lots of bread. That you're definitely not going to be eating that. And we even learn in a brisa like this to show that it can be really any Yom Tiv. Beishami omim ein ofen pasove b'Yom Tiv uvesilo matirin. That Beishami says don't make pasove on Yom Tiv, and Besil says you're allowed to make pasove on Yom Tiv. Meaning in this brisa it doesn't specify Pesach. It just says it could be any Yom Tiv. That on any Yom Tiv don't make more bread than you can possibly need because it's an extra burden on the Yom Tiv. Meaning, so while you might be allowed to bake bread on Yom Tif because ochel nefesh is permitted, but bake what you need, not more than that. Taner Rabbanan, the rabbis taught yotzim b'pas nekiya. You're allowed to use matzahs that are clean, that are nekiya, that are made from like fine flour. Uveh, and on the opposite end of the spectrum, you can also use matzahs from very coarse flour. And you can also use these decorated matzahs b'Pesach. Even though they said, meaning, so you can be yotzei with srikin amitzuyarin, even though they said that you shouldn't really make decorated matzahs on Pesach. Omer Rabbi Yehuda, Davrzeh Shol Baisus Benzun L'Chacham Mipnei Ma'amru in Osin Srikin Amitzuyarin b'Pesach. And this is exactly what Baisus Benzunin asked the Chachamim. How come we don't make decorated matzahs on Pesach? Amlo, so they answered, well, because if you have a woman who's making matzahs and they're decorated, and she might end up focusing too much on the decorations and forgetting that we're working against the clock over here, because after 18 minutes it becomes chametz, and it can become a distraction, and the matzah can end up becoming chametz. So to prevent any distractions, we say, no decorations, nothing fancy, all business. Make a flat bread, move on. That way you can be sure that it doesn't become chametz. So Baisus Benzunin suggested, well, I have a good idea. Let's make epis like a cookie cutter matzah. Let's make some kind of a mold that you just kind of stamp onto the matzahs, and it looks beautiful, and you get your fancy decorations, while at the same time, preventing all the fussing that could lead to it becoming chametz. And then you'll be able to just make the decoration very quickly. Amrulo, they said to Baisus Benzunin, they said, look, in principle we agree with you. However, Yomu kol asrikin asurin v'srikin Baisus mutarin. But then what? We're making this is like a low plug over here. Meaning we're gonna have to say what? So you're not allowed to use decorated matzahs unless you get the decorated matzahs from Baisus Benzunin. Ki'ilu, meaning these aren't allowed. These are allowed. It doesn't work like that. If it's not allowed because we're concerned that it might become chametz, so it's not allowed even if you buy Baisus Benzunin and use some kind of fancy mold. Reb Elazar bar Tzadok says, Reb Elazar bar Tzadok, I remember the Reb Elazar bar Tzadok from Masechta Eruvin on Daf Mem Aleph. There was an incident with Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and Reb Elazar bar Tzadok was mentioned over there, and Rashi points out that he lived during the lifetime of Rabbi Gamliel, and we see here as well that he's telling a story about Rabbi Gamliel. Pamachas nechnasti achar abba leveis Rabbi Gamliel. That one time I went after my father to Rabbi Gamliel. Ve'aviu lefanav srikin amitzuyarim b'Pesach, and it was Pesach time, and they brought in front of Rabbi Gamliel these decorated matzahs. Amarti, I said, Abba, didn't the rabbi say einosin srikin amitzuyarim b'Pesach? I thought the rabbi said that we don't make decorated matzahs on Pesach. Omarli, so my father said to me, Bini, my son, lo shall kol adam amru. They weren't talking about just regular matzahs, about regular people making matzahs, that they're not allowed to make decorated matzahs. No. El shel nachtomen amru. They were only talking about bakers. Bakers shouldn't make decorated breads because they have to sell, right? They have to sell these matzahs, and therefore they may end up spending extra time to make it look extra beautiful so that they could sell it extra well. And then it might end up becoming chametz. But just regular people would be allowed to make decorated matzahs. And by Rabbi Gamliel, they just had matzahs from the regular people. Ikadami, to those who say, this is what Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok's father was saying to him. Lo shel nachtomen amru el shel kol adam. No, right, the opposite. No, that meaning when the Chacham said that you're not allowed to have decorated matzahs, it means just regular people. Regular people would not be allowed to make decorated matzahs because they won't be careful. But bakers who are experts and know what they're doing, so then that you can have decorated matzahs from them. And these matzahs at Rabbi Gamliel were from bakers. Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Yossi, osin srikin kmin rikikin, vein osin srikin kmin gluskos. So it says Rabbi Yossi, you could make these decorated matzahs if they're very thin decorated matzahs, but not if they're very thick decorated matzahs. What do you guys think? Okay. Seder. Make them thin, don't make them thick. Sounds good to me. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbi said of Sufganin. I don't know, what do you guys think Sufganin are? Like Sufganiyot, I think. Some kind of like, what does Rashi say? Asuyin kesvug, they're made like a sponge. I don't know, Sufganiyot are kind of spongy. Va'duvshanin. Duvshanin are honey breads, va'iscritin are epis types of wafers. Okay? V'chalas amasres. And also chalas amasres, which we'll explain in a second. Va'meduma. What's meduma? Who could tell me? Meduma is chulin that some truma fell into. P'tur min challah, you do not need to separate the challah tithe from these, mezainis, from these, like bread items. My chalas amasres, what's chalas amasres? Amar Yeshua ben Levi. Ze chalut shobal lebatim. This is this type of scorched, really boiled, bread from the Baalei Batim. Amar Rish Lakish, alalu maise ilpisen. Says Rish Lakish that these would be considered maise ilpis. Maise ilpis are breads that are made in a pan, and breads that are made in a pan are not chayiv, are patur from challah according to Rish Lakish. They would have to dafka be made in an oven. Rabbi Yochanan Amar maise ilpis chayavin. Rabbi Yochanan says no. Breads made in a pan would be chayav in challah. Falalu she'asan b'chama. However, all of these things, the sufganin, duvshanin, etc., they were made in the sun. And if you have bread made in the sun, so then they're patur from challah. Meisvei, we have a kasha against Rish Lakish. Who could tell me what Rish Lakish said? Rish Lakish said that any bread made in a pan is patur from challah. Now listen to this. Hasufganin va'duvshanin va'eskritin, or these sufganin and these duvshanin and these eskritin, right? These sufgani things and these honey breads and the wafers. Asan be'ilpis, if you made them in a pan, chayavin, they're chayav in challah, b'chama p'turin, and if you make them in the sun, then they're patur from challah. It sounds exactly like what Rabbi Yochanan said. Tiyuftei to Shimon ben Lakish. So it's a kasha on Rish Lakish. Amar Ula says Ula Amar Lach Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Rish Lakish will respond to you. Hachav mayaskinan shir siach ulvasof hidbik. Says Ula to answer for Rish Lakish that when this brisa says that if you make bread in a pan, it's patur from challah. No, it's chayiv in challah. That is specifically a pan that was really, really hot. And once it was really, really hot, you put in the bread, right? You put in the dough. So then it'll be chayiv and challah. Aval, hidbik luvasof tiach. But if you first put in the dough and then you heat up the pan, well then, my achinami dipturin, it would be patur from challah. That is how Rish Lakish would answer that. When this brisa says that bread made in a pan is chayiv and challah, it's because it got really hot first. But now the Gemara has a kasha. But if we keep on reading in that, this brisa, which said that if you make bread in a pan, it's chayiv and challah, it also said that if you make bread in the sun, it's patur from challah. Now, once already it's making distinctions between made in a pan and made in the sun, well then, liflok v'lesni bedida, then make the proper distinctions, meaning you made one distinction, pan versus sun, but there are more distinctions to be made. When do we say that in a pan it's chayiv and challah? When you got the pan really hot first and then you put in the bread, in the dough. But if first you put in the dough and then you got the pan hot, it would be patur from challah. So it's a kasha on how we want to answer for Rish Lakish, right? We want to answer for Rish Lakish and say, meh, that brisa is specifically talking about because the pan is really hot. But if that's the case, that's what it was talking about, then we should have had more details in the brisa. The brisa should have been more descriptive. It didn't shy away from mentioning that if you make bread in the sun, it's patur from challah. So how come be vague when it comes to making bread in a pan? So the Gemara says, yeah, the brisa is just missing a few words. Add in these words and all good. When do we say that bread made in a pan is chayiv and challah? Shir tiach l'vasof hidbik, when the pan was really hot and then you put in the dough. But if you first put in the dough and then you heated up the pan, it's then as though you made the dough in the sun, in which case it would be pater from challah tashmakom. And here yotzin b'matzah hina, you can be yotze your chiyuv of achilas matzah mistam on the first night with bread, with matzah that is raw. Okay, we're going to say to what extent can it be raw and it still works. We'll get there in a minute. Uv matzah asuya be'ilpis, and you can also use matzah that was made in a pan. Well, it sounds like if you can be yotze your chiyuv achilas matzah from bread, i.e. matzah that was made in a pan, well, mistam will be chayiv and challah. So chanami she'tiach v'sof hidbik. This is also talking about where it was really hot and then you put on the dough. Okay, fine. My matzah hina, what is this raw matzah? Amar of Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, kol sheporsa ve'in chutin nimshachin emena. That raw matzah is considered baked enough to be able to be, so you could be yotze your chiyav of achilas matzah if it's baked to the extent that if you break it in half, there's no like doughy, stringy, it's not like cheesy, cause you know what I mean? You know what I mean? Like if you take like a clip art of like a pizza, and it's always the slice separated from the pie, and there's all the cheese dripping off. So imagine if that was like a matzah, and you pull it apart, and there's like strings of dough. If there's strings of dough, then it's not baked enough. But as long as there's no strings of dough, then you can at that point is considered baked enough, so that you could be yotze your chiyuv of achilas matzah. Rava says, and the same distinction would be for breads of a korban toda, that as long as you pull them apart and there's no strings attached, so then it would be considered properly cooked. Pshita, this is obvious. By lachmi toda it says lechem, by matzah it says lechem oni. So, if it's considered baked for one, it should be considered baked for the other. So, well, I may have thought maybe to argue that since by the korban toda it says that you will take one of the matzahs and give it to the kohen, meaning one from each type of matzah. Right, there are 4 types of breads that you bring with the korban toda, so you give one of each to the kohen. So shelo yito parus. So I might think that it has to be echad, right? Echad shelo yito parus. There has to be a complete one, and not a kind of matzah like this that's not super cooked, that you can kind of break apart. Ve'acha command the prisadamya. I might consider that this not fully baked matzah might be considered like it's broken apart. Kamash malon. Therefore, Rav is teaching us that no, you can use once it's baked enough that it doesn't break apart, that it's not stringy when you pull it apart, then it works for matzah and it works also for lachmei toda. Meisvei, we have a kasha. Ha-me'isa. Okay, when it comes to me'isa, we'll have to define that. Beishamai protein v'esila mechayven. Beishamai says it's potter from challah. Beisila says it's chayven challah. Ha-chalita. Okay, we'll have to define what chalita is. Beishamai mechayven v'esila potter. Okay, this time it's the opposite. Beishamai says chayv. Beisila says potter. Fine. Ezu ha-me'isa. What's me'isa? Ve'ezu ha-chalita. What's chalita? Ha-me'isa kemach agami muklashin. Me'isa is that you have flour that you pour into boiling hot water. And chalita is the opposite. Chalita is muglashin shagabe kemach. That you pour boiling water onto flour. Okay, very good. So according to the Tanakame, there's machlokas between Beishamai and Beisilel about these 2 items. One of them, Beishamai says chayev and Beisilel says potter. The other one's vice versa. Fine. Rabbi Shmuel b'noshe Rabbi Yossi. No. Rabbi Shmuel b'Rabbi Yossi Omer. Mishum Aviv, Rishma Rabbi Yossi says the name of his father. I think I pointed out once that I have a suspicion that often when Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi is quoted, he's quoting his father. And this is another one we can add to that sense. But I guess if your father's Rabbi Yossi, you may as well quote him, right? We learned in Masechta Eruvin that Rabbi Yossi was very geschmack. Zeh v'zeh liftor. So Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi says the name of his father that both the chalita and the me'isa are potter from challah. Okay. So those who say that both the Me'isa and the Chalita are chayiv in Challah. That's what he said in the name of his father. Okay, fine. The Chacham say echad zeh v'echad zeh, that both when it comes to the Chalita and the Me'isa, ason be'ilpis potter, betoner chayiv. If you made it in a pan, then it's potter from Challah. If you make it in an oven, then it's chayiv in Challah. That's going to be essentially our question on Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan says that if you make bread in a pan, in an ilpis, it is chayiv in Challah. Yet this brisa, the Chachamim are saying that if you make it in an ilpis, it's potter from Challah. But save that thought. We're going to get back to it in a minute. The Tanna Kama. Now, the Tanna Kama, who said that it's actually machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and they swap opinions, one for the Chalita, one for the Me'isa. Ma'ishna Me'isa or Ma'ishna Chalita. What's the difference between Me'isa and Chalita? Right, we said one is where you put the flour in and then the hot water. The other one is where you put the hot water and then the flour. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, V'cheina Amar Rabbi Yochanan, V'itemi Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, K'machlokas b'zo kach machlokas b'zo. Interesting. So Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, and some say our Mishnah says Rabbi Yehuda, but there's a different case that says Rabbi Yochanan. Some say Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. There's basically an explanation over here that actually what's going on in the Reisha is not that like by one of them Beis Shammai says potter and the other, and Beis Hillel says chayiv and the other one is vice versa. No, rather k'machlokas bazo kach machlokas bazo, that the machlokas is the same for both. That ki'ilu Beis Shammai, if they say potter in one, they also say potter in the other. If they say chayiv in one, then they also say chayiv in the other. V'tavra, and it's actually two tanaim in the Reisha. Mishashana zo lo shana zo, that whoever taught this one didn't teach that one. Meaning, there in the Reisha, we said there's Chalita and there's Me'isa, and for one of them, Beis Hillel says Potter, the one says Beis Shammai says Chayiv, whatever it is. So, we're saying that actually it's two different Tanaim, right? So one Tana was saying that by both the Chalita and the Me'isa, Beis Shammai says Potter and Beis Hillel says Chayiv, and the other one was saying that both by the Me'isa and the Chalita, Beis Shammai says Chayiv, Beis Hillel says Potter. I think I said that right. But basically, there's two different Tanaim. They both agree that Me'isa and Chalita would have the same halachas, just that they have opposite views on what Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel said. Fine. Nu, Katani Mias, so what was the point of all of this that we taught? V'chacham om echad zeh v'echad zeh, shason be'ilpos Potter b'toner Chayiv. Right? But we said that according to the Chachamim, both the Chalita and the Me'isa, if you made them in a pan, you're going to be potter from Challah. If you made them in an oven, you're going to be chayav in Challah. Tiyufta to Rabbi Yochanan, it's therefore a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan said that if you make it in ilpis, it would nonetheless be chayav in Challah. Yet the Chacham over here are saying that if you made it in a pan, it's potter from Challah. So what does Rabbi Yochanan do? So Amalek Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan would respond, Tanoi, the Ma'asetz Machlokas, Tanoim de Tanya. As we learn in a brayso, Me'isa v'chaluta chayav b'chala. Is it possible that Me'isa and chaluta would both be chayav in chala? Tam lomer lechem. No, chaluta and Me'isa cannot be chayav in chala because it says lechem. It has to be lechem, and this isn't lechem. It's like made with boiling water. Okay. Rabbi Yehuda Omer says Rabbi Yehuda ein lechem ela afi b'toner. That in order for something to be considered bread, it has to be baked in an oven, and this wasn't baked in an oven. Rabbi Yehuda Hanu Tanna Kama. The Gemara says, wait a second. Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanna Kama are both basically saying the same thing, right? That the Chalita, what's it called? Chaluta and Me'isa are potter from Challah because they're not considered bread. Both the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yehuda are basically saying that. Rather, it must be that what's the nafkamina between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yehuda? Maisei ilpis must be the nafkamina. That Tanna Kama sav Maisei ilpis chayav and Rabbi Yehuda sav Maisei ilpis p'turid. That it must be that Rabbi Yehuda who says that it's only considered bread if you make it in an oven. So what if you make it in a pan? No, it's not bread. Whereas the Tanna Kama would say that the chaluta and the me'isa is not bread because it is made with like boiling water. But the Tanna Kama would say if it was made in a pan, it would be considered bread. So that's the nafkamina. So that's what. So Rabbi Yochanan wants to therefore argue that the Tanna Kama holds like him. That the Tanna Kama holds that even if you have bread that's made in a pan, it's taka chayav in challah. Rabbi Yehuda says it's not. It will be pater from challah. But says Rabbi Yochanan, I'm like the chachamim. The Gemara says, lo, no. Rather, the Tanakama also agrees that bread made in a pan would be pater from challah. Okay, so what's machlokes? Here it's talking about that even after he baked it in a pan, he cooked it in a pan, he then put it in the oven. The Tanakama says that once you take it and put it back in the oven, we can consider it to be lechem, to be considered bread, and it would be chayiv and challah. Rabbi Yehuda saver ein lechem ela afi b'tanur meikara, that it's only considered bread if it was made in the oven initially. But if it was first made in a pan and then made in the oven, it would not be considered bread, and it would be pater from challah v'chayim d'meikar la b'tanur afyei lav lechem hu. Since this bread, this chalita me'it and chalita, what is this? Chaluta and me'isa. Since it was first made, I guess, with boiling water, and then in an ilpus, and then put in the oven, Rabbi Yehuda says too many steps, and it'll be pater from challah. Rava says, Rava, my time with Rabbi Yehuda. Why does Rabbi Yehuda say that the bread would have to be made in the oven, from the start originally? The pasuk says, that in the tochacha, in the rebuke, in the curses, so it says that 10 women will bake all of their bread together in one oven. Bread that is baked in one oven is called bread, but if it's not baked in one oven, then it's not considered bread. I.e., if it's baked in like other things first, like a pan, and then put in the oven, it wouldn't be considered bread, and be pater from challah, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Yosef, this is really cool. So imagine this: if you're in yeshiva in like Pumbedisa or something, and Yosef Rabba, Rav Yosef, Achor Rav Zera, Rabba and Rav Yosef were sitting behind Rav Zera. Yosef Rav Zera came to Ula, and Rav Zera was sitting in front of Ula. Very, very cool. Amalei Rabba Rav Zera, so Rabba kind of tapped Rav Zera on the shoulder, and he says, "Boi minei me Ula, hey, do me a favor, ask Ula, hidbik mi bifnim v'yatiach mi b'chutz, if he put some bread into a pan and then heated it up from the outside, mahu, what would be the halacha? Would it be chayiv and challah or pater from challah?" Omerle, so Reb Zera says to Rabba, he says, "Why should I ask that to Ula? My emale, why should I say something to him? The aminale, because if I do, Omerle is going to say to me, hey, niu maise ilpis." That's exactly the machlokas that we have about maise ilpis between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. So, or really between Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan about is maise ilpis chayiv and challah or not. The Rabbi Yosef, the Rabbi Zera. So now Rabbi Yosef says to Rabbi Zera, "Boi minei me'ula, ask Ula, hidbik mi b'fnim va'avuka knegdo mau." What if you put some dough in the pan, but then in addition to the heat that's below it, you then also apply heat from on top of it with like a torch or something? Amrle. So Rabbi Zera says, why should I ask Ula? My emale, why should I say anything to him? Aminale, if I say to him, Amrle rovani mosenkin. This is this is my silpas. This is exactly how poor people would cook things in pans, because they wouldn't necessarily have, I guess, the proper setup and enough heat, so they would have to also apply heat from on top with like a torch, and therefore that's just, again, it's just going to be the machlokas about ma'aseh ilpas between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Okay, as Rashi says, she'ein lahem eitzim, because poor people don't necessarily have enough wood for to have proper heating, so therefore they also have to somehow use some kind of torch on top. Okay, well, that was Daf Lamed Zayin, Masechta Pesachim. So what did we learn today? We talked about pas uveh. We had two opinions about pas uveh, what that is. We had the opinion of Rav Huna, who says that pas uveh is a matzah that's a tefach thick. Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba says the name of Rab. Some say he says Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba the name of Rab and the name of Rebbe, says that it just means that you make a lot of bread. That if you make a lot of bread, don't make a lot of bread together at once on Pesach, or really any Yom Tif, because there'll be extra toil on Yom Tif. You can make enough bread for yourself, but don't make bread for the whole month. And then we had discussions about really what is bread that would be chayiv and challah. So we had Rish Lakish says that if, what does it say? What the heck did I write? Oven? Sun. Heated pan. Oh, I see. Yeah, so Rish Lakish says exactly. If it was, if the dough was made in like a very hot pan, so then it would be chayiv and challah. If it was not a hot pan, so then it would be potter from challah. Rabbi Yochanan says no. Any bread that's made in a pan would be chayiv and challah. It's potter if it's made in the sun. Then we had a machlok between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda says that a bread must be baked in an oven. At the beginning, you can't like put it in a pan first and then put it in the oven. But the Chachamim said that you could first put it in a pan and then place it in the oven. That would be acceptable. That was Daf Lamed Zayin. I hope you enjoyed. Peace out.